This is Josh Jelinski, the financial quarterback. Don't touch that dial. Hi, everybody. This is Josh Jelinski, the financial quarterback, and we're on with Charles Wheelan talking about the naked truths about today's market. Charles is the faculty director for the Center of Business, Government, and Society at the Tuck School of Business. He also teaches undergraduate courses, I'm assuming at Dartmouth, right, in public policy. So you have a little government and a little business and a little finance all mixed in.
That's a pretty good description of it. It's kind of an intersection of how things actually happen.
So were you into politics at one time?
Well, you can't really do public policy without being into politics at some time. It's like being into football without going to a game. And so I was a speechwriter for the governor of Maine for a while. I wrote speeches for Mayor Daley in Chicago for a while. I ran for Congress in 2009. So I have down, and then I'm the founder of United America. So we've done referendums around ranked choice voting. So to the extent that I care about public policy and politics is the way that you do it, I've become involved from time to time.
So what was the referendums about?
Well, I would describe myself as kind of a political centrist, somebody who's kind of politically homeless. And I'm also somebody who spends a lot of time thinking about public policy challenges from the growing debt to the cost of healthcare and so on. And so one of the ways that I decided, or we, the people I'm involved with, to kind of push forward solutions that could get broader buy-in is changing the electoral rules so you do ranked choice voting. So it's a single open primary. The top 4 or 5 winners advance, and then you rank your choices. It's how Alaska now elects people. And United America supported a number of those referendums on this cycle. They all failed except for Alaska, which upheld its change.
And that right choice voting was big with Lisa Murkowski winning, right? Wasn't that kind of
Correct. So Alaska first passed it in, I believe, in 2022. And what that meant almost immediately was that Lisa Murkowski, Republican from Alaska, would never have to run in a Republican primary again. She voted to convict Trump on one of the impeachments. She almost certainly would have gone the way of Liz Cheney had she run in a Republican primary, but she was able to win statewide reelection. So, yeah, if you kind of include every voter in every election, then you're going to get slightly different outcomes than if you run your candidates through the partisan gauntlet of a primary.
so the ranked choice voting replaces the primary system?
There are different forms of it, but in Alaska, they got rid of the
No, like
partisan
forget Alaska, you're ideal. So say in New Jersey.
Alaska is the closest to the ideal. So I would take that.
Okay.
That was what was on the ballot in Colorado. It failed. It was on the ballot in Nevada. It passed in 2022, but it had to pass twice and it failed in 2024.
We weren't really going to talk about ranked choice voting, but since you're one of the key figures on it,
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
interesting. Let's say New Jersey adopts ranked choice voting, because I know New Jersey politics a little bit.
It becomes more like a school council election than the elections that we're typically used to. So you got lots of candidates. They all run. And they'll run in the first round, irrespective of party. You can have 3 Republicans, 2 independents, a Green Party, 5 Democrats. What Alaska did, they had 19 candidates running for the House seat, so as many as you want. And they can declare their party, but they're all running in the same race. And everybody can vote in that race. And then the top 4 advance to the second round. It would be like a runoff if you had 2 advancing. Instead, you have 4. And the difference between just a straight runoff between 2 and 4 is now you want somebody to emerge with a majority. So what you do is you rank them. You don't have to, but 1, 2, 3, 4. And if one candidate gets a majority of the first place votes, then the election's over. It's no different than a runoff. But if not, if somebody say gets 47%, then whoever is last gets eliminated. And all the people who had that person as their first choice vote now get their second choice becomes their first choice. And then you add it up and do it all over again. So one way to think about it is imagine that Florida had ranked choice voting in the presidential race in 2000. And a whole, not a lot, 5% of the people voted for Nader. Nader obviously wasn't going to win. He gets eliminated. And then in the second round, those people all get their second choice, which may have been Gore. If you do use it with Perot in 92, maybe their second choice might have been George H.W. Bush. The idea is that third party candidate doesn't play a spoiler role.
Hmm. I don't know if I like it. I haven't thought about it too much other than like what I didn't like. This is just kind of an aside. Republican and Democratic primaries are now like they have 19 candidates and people are just running now to become famous.
Yeah, and you can win one of those primaries, with 27% of the vote. So you can win with a small number of votes.
So I guess that solves that problem.
It solves that problem. It does mean that every voter can vote in every publicly funded election. So in a lot of states, you have independents who don't really get a choice until they face the general election ballot, which is somewhat distortionary. Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth thinking about.
I remember when Dennis Kucinich was like the first kind of fringe candidate to really run in a primary. And he kind of, to me, is the poster boy for, and Vivek Ramaswamy is the new one, right? Like you have these people who really have no hope of winning and they develop a whole national profile now. So if I
Yeah,
want to be famous, I'm just going to run for a primary next.
yeah, I'm gonna run for president. I mean, Andrew Yang probably fits that
Yeah, he was
category.
another one. Yeah.
He's launched the forward movement. Yeah, I mean, if I can't have a reality show, I'm gonna run for president or for Senate and then see what happens.
And it seems like it's only gotten worse. Where there were then, I want to say, it was like the non-Trump primary last time. How many people were there in that one? 12 or
Yeah, so when I ran for Congress in Chicago, it was a special election because Obama had been elected. He appointed Rahm Emanuel as his chief of staff. Rahm was my congressman. So it was an open seat. As we discussed already, if you're doing public policy, that was the financial crisis, and economics is purportedly your expertise, then you ought to be willing to step into the arena. But there were so many candidates in that race that when the Chicago Tribune did their endorsement session, you kind of come in and talk to the editors. They did two tranches, the varsity and the JV. And it was kind of like the people who might win and the people with no chance of winning. And thankfully, I made the varsity. I was close, I got to admit. But kind of on our way out, we passed all the JV people waiting in the lobby, and the Tribune had basically said, like, as a courtesy, we'll speak to you, but you're not going to see playing time here.
do you have any political aspirations going forward or not really? You're done with it.
It's not even clear I had political aspirations then. I mean, it's kind of like I viewed it like running for the school board. It's not something that anybody who's doing it for the right reason really wants to do. I'd rather spend my Tuesday nights at home rather than getting yelled at about textbooks. But it is something that you kind of got to be willing to do if you care about issues like the debt and healthcare and everything else. So, all else equal, I prefer that really good people did it instead of me. But in the absence of that, I think you got to kind of be willing to step up.
I have a friend of mine who's a political operative. I won't tell you his name because he's kind of a controversial figure, but one of the smartest guys I know in politics, um, either side. He says that one of the key ways to solve politics in America is to actually have a higher salary for those in Congress. Because he says he tries to recruit candidates and he can't get good candidate recruitment anymore because people don't want to ruin their lives for 150 or 200 grand a year jobs because you have people who sometimes they're small business owners are making $1 million a year, 500 grand a year, 600 grand a year, whatever it might be. They have to take a pay cut. Then they have to piss off half of their customers. Excuse my French. Um, so they don't do it. They often don't want to run, or they have trouble recruiting good candidates. So then they recruit more fringe people who maybe were a bartender. No offense if you're a bartender in former life, it's a viable job, but kind of like they're not getting people who are running businesses as much as they used to. I mean, you might get somebody like a Trump or maybe a Mark Cuban next cycle who's so super rich that they can just.
Right, but that's its own problem as well, right? Like you create this. You don't want anybody running for Congress for whom this is going to be the best job they ever did. So I don't disagree with that premise at all. I don't know if it would
And
solve the
he's a
problem.
Republican, so he wasn't like, he's a fiscally kind of conservative guy. And he said you need to have like you almost need to have a salary for Congress of like 500,000 a year.
Yeah, because it's an awful job. I mean, I think that you kind of have to underscore. And if it's a great job for you, then you're probably not somebody who's leaving tremendous opportunities, which is kind of what you want. You don't have to be an elitist to say that you want people who are thriving elsewhere to take this job, but it is a step down. And there's elsewhere there's an incontrovertible theory that when you got a lot of corruption, say in developing countries, the answer usually is pay them more, pay your civil servants more, because then they won't take bribes that would risk a really nice pension and a nice salary. So I don't think there's anything crazy about that theory at all.
Yeah, and that was interesting coming from a more right wing side where he was, hey, pay him more because we're not getting like we're getting very low candidate quality in certain races. And he even said with the Republicans, they would have done a lot better if they had better candidates
Yeah.
this
I mean,
this
I
cycle.
would spend a lot of time talking to politicians, including senators, ex senators, and to a person now, they'll tell you it's just a really bad job. They seem remarkably unhappy. I mean, I remember we did an event with Joe Manchin, and he couldn't leave the Senate fast enough. And he was somebody who had a lot of sway. I mean, he really wasn't at the whims of the party leaders. It was just like, look, I can't wait to see the backside of this city. So, is more money enough to do that? I don't know. The reputational risk, the unpleasantness of raising money, there are a whole host of
I
things
think
that
it
just
would help with Congress. I don't know if it would help with the Senate, but
now. There's most of the Senate's so rich anyway. I do think for the House it
I
might.
think for
Yeah.
the House would be a big help. So you are the author of many nonfiction books, including the Naked series. What prompted you to start the Naked series? Naked Economics, Naked Statistics, and Naked Money.
Yeah, I wrote Naked Economics almost by accident to the extent you can write a book by accident. So I was the Midwest correspondent for The Economist. I got my PhD in public policy, and I really wanted to write for The Economist because it was one place that really does reward deep knowledge of a subject. So I was the Chicago correspondent for The Economist in the late 90s. And you may or may not remember if, in about 1995, if you went to Iowa, maybe a little earlier, it was still illegal to have a bingo game in a church if you could win money. If you fast forward less than 10 years, they probably had 15 riverboat casinos. They had slots at the horse racing venues. So there was this explosive period of growth in gambling of all kinds. And I was fascinated by it. I wrote about the growth in gambling. I wrote about the compacts that the states negotiated with the Indian casinos. I wrote about gambling problems and so on. So I was fascinated by the industry, even by the casino design, having no windows and no clocks and pumping in oxygen. I was trying to write a book about the gambling industry. It was going nowhere, but I did have an agent. And one day I got this side hustle teaching economics to journalists at Northwestern's Medill School. I was looking for a book on economics that I could use that would not drown them in math but would make them realize why this is so powerful, why you really need to understand economics. So I told my agent, I said, look, I need to find this book. You know publishing better than I. Where do I find it? And there's this long pause. And she said, well, I don't think it exists, but you're going to write it. And it's going to be called Economics for Poets. And I'm going to read it. And that was the birth of the Naked series. She sold that. I wrote it. It did very well. The publisher suggested we keep going. We did Naked Statistics. It turns out there's kind of a vacuum for these books that could accurately describe the big ideas without drowning people in the minutia that made everybody hate them.
Describe some of the big ideas. People don't really understand economics still. I mean, if you think of tariff policy or all these things that are now being all the things we're now trying again with sort of the rise of populist politicians on the left and the right. They're things that have been tried before historically and failed, and people just don't even understand economics anymore. So, what are some basic economic principles people should understand?
Well, let's start with the tariffs because the principle there is just they're trade-offs. If there were a policy that made everybody better off and nobody worse off, we would have done it 150 years ago. Instead, you're left with policies like tariffs. Okay, so really, what is it? You're raising the price of imported goods. And all else equal, that does mean that domestic goods now have a price advantage, but it is really a tax. It's a tax on things that you buy from abroad. But then the trade offs kick in, which is okay. There are a lot of domestic companies that use foreign inputs. So if you're making cars and suddenly steel is more expensive, then your cars, which might be a prized export, become more expensive. And so the trade-offs, I would say, are one. There is no free lunch. That's the Milton Friedman line, and it rings true. The minimum wage is another one that I think the left often gets wrong, which is if you raise the price of labor, it's really good for low skill workers who don't lose their jobs. But we know some on the margin, if I tell you an employer it's going to cost you 25% more to hire employees who aren't any more productive, then you're going to substitute high skilled labor, you're going to substitute technology, you're going to do other things, and there will be fewer people employed. So trade offs is one, incentives is another. If you change the price of things, if you raise the income tax dramatically in Connecticut, New Jersey, New York, then there are going to be a lot more Florida residents. So these kinds of things, those would be a couple, I think, of the core ideas that you don't need a lot of math to figure out.
Do policymakers ever come to you? I mean, you were running, I'm assuming, for Congress as a Democrat. I always thought Democrats in New Jersey, I'm from New Jersey, why will they not get basic economic principle and just have our state taxes kind of have parity with, let's say, Pennsylvania or something? If you look at how Virginia has grown or North Carolina or South Carolina, you don't need to have zero state income tax, but there is a point where people start to move.
The reason you don't want zero tax, I say that in New Hampshire, where we have zero tax, is your services start to suffer. And people might move because the schools aren't that good. If you have special needs kids, they're not getting what they want. So it's like finding a balance. I don't know why policymakers ignore this stuff other than it makes for a cleaner soundbite when you can pretend there's no complexity. The flip side is I just don't understand why Republicans often will ignore what we know about markets, which is there are externalities. If I'm making paint and I can save money by dumping my lead in this creek that goes behind the factory, I will do that. And it's going to pollute the drinking water of everybody downstream. So Milton Friedman, Gary Becker, all my University of Chicago for predecessors would tell you, look, you got to fix externalities. So that seems to be the blind spot on the right. Taxes, trade-offs tends to be the blind spot on the left. But yeah, I think we'd probably all be better off if everybody had a little bit more foundational economic knowledge or just chose not to ignore it.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, we have who's our governor? The Goldman Sachs guy, Murphy, Governor Murphy. You would think he would get it, as a Goldman Sachs alum, he would have some, but that doesn't seem to be.
Yeah,
It's,
and
I
I
mean,
can't answer it. And you look at Florida, which has very low taxes and attracts people, but then that does, I wouldn't say that their schools are lighting it on fire. So you're gonna pay a price on the services side.
but
So
that's why I look at like Pennsylvania, Virginia, right? I mean, they're not even Georgia, right? They're state income tax around 5%. They're not losing people, where there seems to be like if your state income tax is above 5 to 7%, people start leaving.
yeah, and
Um,
you could look at that empirically, say what is too much. Certainly, California, whatever it is, 13% is just crazy. Theoretically, we know at some point people are going to move, and then you can. That's what economists do. You can empirically say, all right, how much is too much? At what point is the pot so hot that the frog actually jumps out?
have you done any studies on New Jersey, New York? How many people are really leaving for Florida? Because
I have not. All I know is that once every 2 years, I play in this member guest golf tournament on Nantucket with a middle school friend of mine. And for me, it's like a field trip with the 1% of the 1%. It's like it should be tax deductible because I learned so much. And, you're playing golf with people who are very nice. You'd spend a couple hours, you're walking. And so the first question you always ask somebody is like, where are you from? That's a very and yet, the answer it's almost like a joke. The answer year after year with these people who are worth a lot of money is, "Well, I'm from New Jersey, but I live in Florida. I'm from New York, but I live in Florida." It's amazing. And so I guess that I don't know. You could publish those results.
I think you should because you'll hear then counterpoints like, oh no, net migration still strong because like if you take New Jersey, New Jersey's a hub of immigrants. So we have a lot of different ethnicities moving in from other countries and it sort of counterbalances the population loss. But there's no real studies that I've seen on there's the U-Haul ones and the moving van, but of that higher echelon, the people who are paying the most tax, I I mean, from helping, I own an RIA, an SEC registered RIA. A large percentage of our clients, our wealthiest clients, are moving to Florida, Texas, mostly Florida. I mean, some South Carolina, North Carolina. Which North Carolina and South Carolina, they have some taxes, right? So there is that argument that you have like there's a number that people say is too much.
Yeah, and, I would compare it with Massachusetts because Massachusetts, it's got the name Taxachusetts, but I suspect that it might be lower than New Jersey, and I don't hear as much about out migration, in part because the schools and other services in Massachusetts are pretty good.
Well, I also think in Massachusetts it's already happened, right? So the southern part of New Hampshire really houses the people that moved due to tax flight. So if you stayed with Massachusetts being so bad already. Also, my mother is from Massachusetts and her whole family, she was the only one to move out of that area. So I don't know if New England has a hold more on its.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing is we're entering a whole new era, like, when you look at what's happened with Florida and property and the hurricane risk and the difficulty of buying insurance, like, there's gonna be a whole 'nother iteration here and maybe a chance for some of these northern states to get their feet back under them because they've got infrastructure and they're going to have water and it's not going to be 130 degrees in the summer. So, if I were to your point, if I were one of those governors, I'd say, look, we got another shot at this.
They're not getting it right. The only blue state that seems to get it right is Pennsylvania, where they've kept, but that I think has been due to they usually have conflicted government there.
Yeah, I mean that we should put a pin in that because there was a period where the most popular governors in America were Republicans in deep blue states. I mean, I'm across the river. Literally, I can like look across the river into Vermont, and one of the most popular governors in America is Vermont's Republican governor. Like you could win a lot of money if you went into a pub anywhere and said, "Hey, do you think the governor of Vermont is a Republican or a Democrat?" 99 people are going to say, "Oh, of course it's a Democrat." But Maryland was the same. Larry Hogan in Maryland, and you had Charlie Baker in Massachusetts. And I think the commonality there is you had kind of an activist legislature, and then people are like, okay, but yeah, I want an adult in the state house to be like, yes, no, no, yes, maybe. Like that's kind of an interesting
Yeah,
thought.
even Chris Christie had 2 terms. Watch New Jersey next go around could go red. There's
Really?
mass migration from New York, particularly a migration of Jewish groups from Brooklyn to Lakewood, Tom's River. They're seeing large pluralities of like what Camden, New Jersey and Newark is to the Democrats. Ocean County, New Jersey is for the Republicans. So you're seeing, 10-1 voting blue in some of the cities. You're seeing 10-1 red in Ocean County. So it's one of the fastest 2 or 3 growing towns. And a lot of the people got sick of, I guess, what they would describe as kind of anti Semitic treatment in COVID. So they're leaving the city in droves for more Republican suburbs. They were registered D's in New York. Now they're more registered R's in New Jersey. And you could see the next gubernatorial race, I think, in New Jersey go red.
I think it's just such a fascinating period because in some ways we're still seeing the churn from the financial crisis. I mean, people are still angry about that. And then you had COVID on top of it. And this really interesting political alignment, culminating obviously in the presidential election, where I think obviously the Republicans are in a process of change because Trump has taken over that party. It's got a more nationalist bent. Tariffs are something you couldn't imagine Republicans being front and center 20 years ago. And now, of course, the Democrats are going to do some soul searching that they purport to be the party of the working class, but that's not really the way things are shaping up. So we've got this kind of economic tumult. We've got the two political parties reinventing themselves potentially, and then you've got this like geopolitical risk all around us. It's just I can't think of a time in my adult lifetime when there's been so much uncertainty in so many different areas all around the world.
Oh, it's crazy. And then if you think about what's going to happen next political cycle,
Yeah,
who's
which
going
is going to
to
start like this afternoon. I
is
mean,
it going to be AOC versus Vance? Is it going to be AOC versus DeSantis. So you almost have this hardening pendulum. You probably won't have. I always hear what's that guy Harold Ford Jr. when he's on. I always like to listen to him because I'm like, whatever happened to people like him in
Yeah,
government?
boy, I gotta tell you, it's been a long time since I've heard that name.
But he was on Fox a lot this year, and I always remember he was the rising star. He
Oh,
was supposed to
I
be the next,
completely remember. Yeah,
and he was eloquent. He was
yeah, yeah,
well spoken. He was middle of the road. Like, oh well, it'd be nice to see him run for some, but he's not running for anything. So
yeah, yeah.
uh,
So we'll see.
anyway,
There's
so
a lot going on in the world.
let's get back to the naked. If you could write more chapters to add to Naked Economics that would reflect today's economic outlook, what are some principles you'd want to add?
Well, I would probably put something in it that more directly connected political risk to economics. This is a book that was written to like 2001. You had 9/11, but we kind of assumed that the Soviet Union was in the rearview mirror. So markets and capitalism were ascendant, and the old Iron Curtain had adopted democracy. So it kind of took as a starting point this idea that we believe in democracy, we believe in markets. And in some ways, both of those things are under assault all around the world. You got a high proportion of students saying they don't believe in capitalism, shocking numbers saying they're not supportive of democracy. So I would probably put something in there. And I'm kind of doing it now because the next book is Naked Government, making a case for why markets and democracy kind of fit together because they both start with the individual acting as the unit that you care about and then putting some constraints on it. I'd probably put some more in there. Then that is kind of the political economy stuff that rather than taking the system for granted, I'd probably put a little bit more in there saying, yeah, this is why in the long run, this is the system we ought to support.
Yeah, there's from Dartmouth, right? The French FAMA theory, what the efficient market hypothesis, um, which I think a lot of financial types, because I'm a financial show, they sort of their theory, the FAMA French three-factor model, and that government markets are efficient. When you said political risk, I kind of took it and said, well, there's this been for 100 years sort of this unquestioned belief that we're in a free market, and the free market hypothesis that markets are going to naturally go up in a democracy. I want to see political, I don't know if you've thought about this, but political risk affecting markets, meaning markets are not really behaving efficiently anymore. Have you ever given thought to that?
Yeah, yeah. So, I had dinner with Michael Porter, the competitiveness guy, maybe 7, 8, 9 years ago. And he had become involved in political reform for exactly the reason that you described, which is so Porter was always analyzing factors of competitiveness. So, what constrained your business? Was it human capital? Was it regulation? Was it infrastructure? It was always kind of these things we traditionally associate with business inputs. And I think he used to poll Harvard Business School alums to ask them this question. And what he was getting back is more and more people were saying, well, dysfunctional government of some sort is starting to become an impediment to what I do. So he stumbled upon kind of what the public policy people had always said and what observers around the world can tell you, which is you need some level of functional government for markets to do what they do. You can't have corrupt bureaucrats, you can't have inadequate infrastructure, you can't have a shortage of workers. And I think we kind of took that for granted for too long.
How have readers of your Naked series said your books have helped them?
Well, I would say for most people, it's that they started with an assumption that they would hate economics or they would hate statistics, or maybe they already did. And then they realize, like, oh, it's much broader than just a single company making more money. It explains human behavior in realms that have to do with business, but also have to do with poverty and fighting disease and other kinds like that. So usually it's helped them because it has broadened their view of what economics is. And it has made them appreciate, which is kind of how I got to my appreciation for economics, that it's really a set of tools that are super powerful if you want to understand the world and presumably you want to change it.
Are there any economic assumptions or myths that you think need to be reconsidered in today's current political or economic climate?
I don't know that they're myths. I would say it's kind of what we were talking about earlier. I think there's some reminders. I think that the Democrats need to be reminded that there is no free lunch. That at some point you can overregulate and overtax things. And the best example of that is the Draghi report, which came out, what, 3 or 4 weeks ago, which is Mario Draghi, former head of the European Bank, former prime minister of Italy, saying, look, we've seen shockingly little growth in Europe. If you go back, I don't know, I would say 20 years ago, Europe had been converging with the United States after having been destroyed in World War II. And then that convergence stopped. And the United States has been growing much more quickly than the European Union. And Draghi basically says, look, we have to be more innovative, more competitive. And we ought to do that by revamping our regulations, thinking again about the tax structure, doing things that make people as productive as they might be. So that, that's the reminder for people on the left. There are limits to what you can do, even if your heart is big on the redistribution regulation front. And on the right, it's what we were talking about earlier, which is there are byproducts of commerce that need to be ameliorated by government. Climate change is one of them. It is also true that some humans, just by dint of really bad luck, end up in a really bad place, either because the General Motors plant closed or they became victims of the opioid crisis. And there is, to my mind, scope for putting some cushion under that. And in some ways, that makes you a more vibrant economy. So I don't know that those are oversights as much as just they've always been there. We just kind of stopped thinking about them because of our political views.
Yeah, it's interesting. You're in academia. Do you get flack for being not liberal enough or too conservative? You seem kind of too middle of the road.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's just like depends who you're talking to. I mean, academe
You
is
seem
as
kind of
liberal.
middle of the road for academia, so, which I guess you'd be conservative in academia,
I'm
right?
very conservative by academic standards and probably more liberal by when I go with my finance friends. I feel like I'm always out of place. My wife is from Boulder, Colorado, and so I'd go visit her family over the holidays, and I felt like Genghis Khan, or Milton Friedman was like, oh my god, yeah, I believe in the private market, in which case they're like, whoa. Then I go home to my family who are, from the suburbs of Chicago, kind of country club Republicans. And I feel like Bernie Sanders because I'm saying, like, well, homelessness is a problem. And so I just feel like I've always been out of place. But yeah, I mean, academia is very left leaning. That said, there's more gradation there. The government and econ departments tend to be much more mainstream than, say, the humanities. There's kind of a whole ecosystem there. But I certainly don't take any grief from students because students kind of come in and they just want to see the whole elephant. And so in the classroom, it was fine.
With the rise of technology and automation in economics, what are some important economic issues that need to be addressed?
Well, obviously, AI. I mean, you're old enough to remember, I would assume, that when the internet came along, mid 90s, it was going to be good for democracy. It was going to be good for social connections. It was going to be good for news gathering. Right. And 20 years later, it's like, well, it seems to have fractured social connections. It's promulgated fake news, and it hasn't been all that great for democracy. So I think, so like, other than that, so I think for AI is going to be as disruptive. We can't really purport to know how, but maybe even faster and more extreme than the internet. And so I think what you have to do is engineer a society that's kind of more resilient for those changes. And I'm not sure that we've given up focus to that. So less thinking about, wow, all the cool things the AI can do, which is kind of what we did with the internet, and that's terrific. But maybe more thinking about the guardrails that you put around it as the destruction gets flung along the way.
I mean, I'm very close to getting rid of my smartphone and just going back to the old flip phone.
Yeah, it's very retro, right? Yeah.
And I'm seeing that more and more, and maybe that's due to social media making things like homeschooling, homesteading, things like this more popular. So I guess that's a good thing. But No, because if you think about it, like what take the smartphone, for example. Instead of, hanging out with your family, you're looking at your phone. You're distracted, you know. You're not reading books together with your children. So my wife and I are trying to sort of going back to the old ways. And it's tough though because I have a Tesla and I call them up and I'm like, "Can I use my car without a smartphone?"
Yeah, you're right, right. We bake the technology
And
into
then
our
they go,
lives.
"No." Uh so I think my way around it is I'm going to get rid of the smartphone, but then keep an iPad or an iPhone in my office to kind of separate it from my home. So if I need service on my car, I'll just use it there. I think those types of things were unheard of 10 years ago. And now, because people are seeing the dopamine effect and how all these social media connections, I mean, I think of it, probably people that people near and dear to me, dealing with depression and
Oh, it's terrible. I mean, I think if we could recommend a book, I'd recommend The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt, which is a distillation of all the social damage wrought by social media, including depression for young kids. My wife is an elementary school principal, so they don't have smartphones in the schools, but then the kids kind of grow into it. And it really is a different kind of existence, and it does impair your ability to interact with other human beings. I mean, you've probably seen you go out to a restaurant and there'll be two people and they're clearly on a date and they're both on their phones. They're not even talking to each other. And I just want to get up and take their phones away. Or, a family out to dinner, three kids and two parents, and they're all on their phones. Why did you even bother? Um, and I mean, that's just kind of one thing. I don't think we've come to grips nearly with the social changes that have been brought about by that. And then, as I said, and now AI is going to take us to a whole new place.
yeah, I just think you got to opt out of the system a little bit because it'll just engulf you. It's like the Matrix. And we're doing little things to improve our life, kind of de taking technology out as much as we can. And I think that's what you got to do because you got to go back to what were the old layers of social cohesion, right? People would go to church together, synagogue together, they'd go to the 4-H club. They would do things with people, real people.
So let me tell you one of my favorite memories as a professor. So for years, for probably 15 years, I've led classes where we travel as a group. I've gone to Liberia, to South Africa, to India, to Jerusalem, to Oman. And one year, and there's always a theme. So one year I took students to Britain, Ireland, and Northern Ireland, and we were looking at the peace process. The last stop was Belfast. And one of the cool things was it was December. Nobody goes to Belfast for as a tourist in December. So we had a whole bed and breakfast to ourselves. So 13 students, me and my son. Yeah, we had a main floor where we ate, rooms upstairs. It was really cool. And the students had a memo due. So they were working really hard. They were all sick because it was 32 degrees and rainy. And I said, look, nobody's allowed to work tonight. I'm declaring a moratorium. What do you guys want to do? They're all 21. They were all seniors. They said, we want to get beer and wine and order Indian food. I'm like, terrific. So we bring in a bunch of Indian food. And then they spent the night playing charades. So here are these Dartmouth seniors. They're in fraternities and sororities and sports. But what they really wanted to do was spend the night playing charades. And it was awesome. I'm like, wow, this is really cool. And they were interacting in a way that they're going to remember forever. And that too often, I think, has been lost. But there is a yearning to rediscover it because it's really fun.
No, exactly. So in Naked Statistics, you write about the concept of statistical literacy. How would you rate the general public statistical literacy today and what can be done to improve it?
And so if I'm giving a letter grade, are we going to have grade inflation or not? Because it's if I gave it a B plus in the current environment, that's like a failing grade. So let's do it without grade inflation. It's very, very poor. And that constitutes kind of two pieces. One is we maybe never had, but certainly don't have now, a sense of discerning what's a reputable authority, what's not a reputable authority. If you read something on the internet, a study finds, is that a peer reviewed Harvard study that validates another study? Or is this something that somebody's done where you opt in on the internet and it's self selected? People just, and I think the media is as guilty as anybody, they just can't discern between things that have scientific validity and things that don't. And then you kind of go one step further, and I'm not sure people appreciate the difference between a median and a mean and how things can be skewed and how if you've got a really self-selected sample, it's going to be way off. So unfortunately, I think there's a lot of room for improvement. And it does mean that we're less capable of absorbing important information about everything from COVID to immigration to to the size of the debt. They're important issues that are informed by data. And we don't have all the tools that I think we need to fully understand that.
Yeah, you got me thinking about the Real Clear Politics poll average because during the, I mean, I was more preoccupied with who was going to win the election due to the kind of the markets and the impact on the stock market. And I remember how accurate the Real Clear Politics poll average was. People always talk about Nate Silver. I always saw that his, and you might like him or whatever, but when I would go on his thing, it always skewed certain results. And I didn't like his averages. I didn't like it not because of a political bent, just because it didn't look accurate to me, but because the Real Clear Politics average kind of weighted things and skewed it for 2016 abnormalities in 2020. I think it was only off last time by 1 or 2%, and this time it was only off by like 1%. So I was thinking, does that have anything to do with statistical literacy?
No, but it has to do with the one aspect of statistics that's gotten routinely harder, and that is polling. So I'll tell you a story. In 2011, we had the editor in chief of Gallup come to Dartmouth, forget Frank Newport. And he said, look, polling is the one aspect of scientific data gathering that's getting worse. And you're not used to anything in the world getting worse. Like once you're good at something, how do you forget the knowledge? And he said, and it's all obvious after the fact. But he said, all right, first of all, caller ID is a disaster. Again, I grew up in an era where the phone rang, there's no caller ID, you answer. But now I live in New Hampshire. I don't answer the phone in the 9 months before the presidential race because it's all polling. So that means that a high proportion of people you need to reach are not picking up the phone. And the people who do are like lonely widows. So you've got a huge skew there. The less obvious one is cell phones. So now people have multiple lines. It used to be that I couldn't get you twice. But even less obvious than that is that your cell phone has an area code that probably doesn't coincide at all with where you live anymore. So back in the day, say 1970, if we had a poll and it was heavy on 312 numbers, short on 617 numbers, we knew that we didn't have enough people in Massachusetts and we had too many people in Chicago. Now there's many 312 people living in Massachusetts, so you can't even tell what it is that you've left out or oversampled. So this is one where technology, ironically, has made it harder. And Newport said then they were thinking of going back to door polling, which is something they did when telephones first came up because only rich people had telephones. So I don't know if they've done that, but you look at the response rate on some of these polls, and they're shockingly low numbers, or they're internet polls, which is only people who are online taking the time to do it are the ones whose ideas are captured. So you get stuff like Nate Silver making all these corrections after the fact. And that's introducing an element of judgment that really isn't meant to be part of polling. So, I mean, I kind of ignored most of them because I just figured that they were all correcting in some ways that may or may not be accurate.
Yeah, I always found Silver's to be not accurate. The one I liked the best was the Real Clear Politics average.
Yeah. I mean, I like the betting markets. That's kind of interesting. I remember, yeah, the morning after the debate when Biden had his disastrous performance, I had to teach a class and there was some discussion about whether he was going to drop out or not. And of course, the Democrats were still saying there's no chance he'll never drop out. And I went on to one of the betting sites. I can't even remember which one it was. And it showed there was only about a 30% chance that he actually was the nominee who ran in the race. So there's like a 70% chance of him dropping out, which is way higher than anybody would have guessed based on media attention. And that obviously turned out to be true.
Yeah, so the betting market's pretty good. I have to look at the you made me think about the polls. Um, what was the spread? The Real Clear Politics battleground average had Trump at about 0.8%. I don't know what the average ended up being. The betting average was 60% Trump, 38 Harris. The multi-candidate average was Trump 0.1. So pretty close to what ended up. And then they they did a comparison of 2020 to 2024, 2020 to 2016. They tried to. I found that did a. I think with Trump, you always have the factor of like people who are voting for Trump don't want to be judged, so they're not going to tell you they're voting for Trump.
Yeah, I mean that's like a layer of complexity on top of everything else. I mean, the other thing is, as a candidate, as somebody who's got kind of a scientific mind, I asked my campaign director, I'm like, well, what do we know? We do a regression analysis, and the dependent variable was, either you vote for somebody or you don't vote for somebody. What are the things that come up significant on the right hand side of the equation? And he's like, yeah, we don't really know. So I'm like, okay, well, we're sending mail to their households. We're running ads. We're doing Facebook ads. Like, which of these things actually reach people? He said, well, hey, we don't really know. I mean, it's like that old adage from advertising. I'm wasting half my ad dollars. I just wish I knew which half. And you said for all the science, the polling, the science of election is still driven by human emotion, which in some ways kind of belies a scientific explanation.
There's always new variables. Like they say this year
Yeah,
was
yeah,
the
yeah.
year of the podcast.
Yeah, right, right. And it's all, who knows? It's all after the fact, you know. And in fact, these are complicated human beings weighing lots and lots of things. How do you weigh abortion versus immigration versus inflation? They all get muddled around different for different people. So it is at the end of the day more Shakespearean than it is statistics.
Have you done any study on the role of podcasts in these elections?
I have not. I don't even know how you would go about it, like how you would tease out.
There've been all these articles that Barron Trump had something to do with the last minute push. So if you kind of look at the last 30 days of the campaign, Kamala tried to get on what was the big podcast? Call Her Daddy, but it was all more scripted.
Yeah.
And then Trump went on Rogan.
Yeah.
Kamala wouldn't go on
Yeah.
Rogan.
Yeah.
Um, Trump went on a bunch of them, a bunch
Yeah.
of the top. Dave Ramsey,
Yeah.
he went on a bunch of them, and they're saying that could, hey, in such a small percentage go one way or the other, could have had a great big impact.
Yeah, I guess this will be for the historians and the statisticians to hash out. By then, we'll be into the 2028 election. We'll be arguing about new
Yeah, it'll
things.
be something else new will pop up. So inflation, you've explained the fundamentals of inflation in your books. What types of inflation do we need to worry about right now?
Well, the first thing I would distinguish is like real price increases. So things that are getting expensive relative to other goods, even if the overall price level isn't changing much. And I think that matters as much as anything. So, I've heard people say like inflation's not a big deal. Prices aren't really going up except for higher education, housing, and food. And I'm like, well, what the hell else is there? Right. Like, and so there's some things, housing being one, where it's not really inflation. It's just that housing is becoming more expensive relative to other goods. And that is a really important one to follow because a big part of the American dream is, can I afford a home? Can I afford to own my own home? And that's just a function of supply and demand. There are too many places in this country where local zoning laws, and I'm sitting in one of them, constrain the housing and supply because you can't build anything new. You can't rent out your garage. You can't build apartment buildings. There's plenty of demand. You don't need public housing. You just need to let the market build what it would build. So that's getting more expensive in real terms. Leave aside inflation. Healthcare is getting more expensive in real terms for a whole bunch of reasons that we'd need like 9 hours to explain, but mostly because technology is expensive. People are highly skilled. third-party payer, so you're not really paying your own bills and so on. And higher education is getting expensive for all kinds of reasons, some good, some bad. But those are things that people really care about. If you think about like what is important for your lives, for the lives of your children, it's going to be, can they get a college degree if they want one? Can they afford housing? And is healthcare going to bankrupt me? So those are real price increases. And then inflation is just kind of the increase in everything. And that's a function of a lot of things, but mostly it's just too much money chasing not enough goods, whether it's supply chain snafus or really loose monetary policy. But then you get rising prices everywhere.
The Fed may take a more cautious approach to lowering interest rates next year. What do you think about interest rates? Where do you think they're headed next year?
So I don't know because well, first of all, because I just don't, I'm not really a Fed watcher, but like the thing that I don't think people are talking enough about, you tell me because you're probably deeper in these circles, is at some point there's going to be a premium because of the debt, which I've kind of alluded to over and over again. We've kind of neither party's paying attention to it. We're kind of like quietly cruise to a place where huge deficits are the norm, despite full employment and a strong economy. It's not the way it's supposed to work. You're supposed to run deficits when you've got problems like COVID or you're trying to fight your way out of the financial crisis. But then when you get a good footing, in theory, you're supposed to run surpluses like we did. I don't know if we ran surpluses, but we certainly, the debt as a percentage of GDP after World War II came down. We borrowed heavily to save democracy. Good on us. And then we got to firmer fiscal ground. Nobody cares about that anymore. And now you've got debt that's 100% of GDP. Double check this, but I believe interest on the debt now constitutes a larger spending bucket than defense. And that's just money you're spending and getting nothing for it. So at some point, not that the US is going to default, but you're going to have to start to pay a premium to borrow, and that's going to get baked into real interest rates. And I don't know what that looks like. That's like the long term picture. And then what the Fed does is shorter term.
Can you explain for our listeners the correlation between interest rates and inflation?
Yeah. So if you think about it like you've got a car and you've got a gas pedal and a brake, and you can kind of be cruising along at 55 miles an hour. That's kind of your stable speed. That'd be like stable prices, which is kind of what we experienced for a really nice 20-year period. If you raise interest rates, then things that require borrowing get more expensive, buying a car, borrowing a house. And so you're going to see less demand for those things. And then all else equal, prices are going to fall. It's going to kind of slow down the economy. You'll have less spending. And either prices will stop increasing if you're trying to fight inflation, or they may even fall, which would be deflation, which is not great. But higher interest rates are like that brake where because you've got control over the cost of borrowing, you can slow things down. And then lower interest rates are the opposite. It's cheaper to borrow. It's cheaper to buy a house. It's cheaper to buy a house. It speeds up the construction industry and so on. So if you lower interest rates, it's like hitting the gas. You can speed things up. So you can speed your way out of a deflationary stretch. You can kind of speed your way to an economic recovery. But if you do it too long, you keep your foot on the gas too long, you're going to go right through 55 miles an hour. And pretty soon you're going to be at 90. And now people want to buy houses, but there's no new supply. People want to add on to their house, but the contractors are full. So they raise their prices. So higher interest rates are the brake and lower interest rates are the gas. And if you got that sweet spot, if the economy's kind of humming along and prices are stable, then you're just driving along at 55 miles an hour, on cruise control.
Do you think inflation is going to be stickier than people realize?
I do. I do, because we went through this long period of time where people assumed prices were stable and that assumption gets baked into the cake. And I lived through the 70s. I was a caddy. What I remember most about inflation is every year I show up as a caddy and the rate be like $1, $2 higher. I just like, that's what happened in the 70s. And if I showed up and it was the same, I'd be disappointed. So, yes, inflation is a lot about expectations. We've kind of broken this expectation that prices will be stable. And so, yes, I think it's going to be harder to bring inflation down when people don't trust that prices won't go up.
Doge, the $2 trillion waste cutting Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk running this quasi governmental, you know, volunteer program. Uh, have you done any research on it? Do you think they'll be successful?
I don't think they'll be terribly successful for a couple of reasons. One is there's this old aphorism in economics that even waste, fraud, and abuse is somebody's income. So this idea that like all the waste, fraud, and abuse is in some storage closet and you're going to find it, be like, oh, there it is. I mean, no, it's going to be people overcharging here and somebody's brother-in-law running a business there, but they don't really want to give it up. So it's going to be hard to find. But I think the bigger problem, which is not fully understood by I think most Americans, is most of the money that we're spending at the federal level is on autopilot. So it's Medicare, and that's it's not easy to cut Medicare. You kind of cut reimbursement rates, but then you run into the trade-off, which is now doctors say, "Yeah, no, thank you, I'm not taking your Medicare anymore." It's Social Security, which is really just printing checks by formula, so there's not a lot of administrative waste there. It's defense, and we've already talked about the uncertainty in the world. This is not, I'm persuaded there's a lot of waste in weapon systems and other stuff, but I couldn't tell you where it is. So defense, then interest on the debt, where we have no legal authority to cut, and kind of you get through those buckets, and there's just not that much left. And what's left, a lot of it is important stuff. It's paving roads and fighting pandemics and stuff. So I wouldn't say that there's not waste, fraud, and abuse. I just think it's going to be trickier to flick some dial and suddenly have government work better at a lower cost.
I go between what you just said, and sometimes I think, because I've heard Elon, and if he's really focused on this, he talks about something that I remember hearing from somebody I know who worked for the prisons. And he said the government waste is not what you think it is. And it's not even listed. It's not like the Tom Coburn, which is what you're saying. Basically, the waste, fraud, and abuse is a small percentage of the budget. It's there, but it might be, 12 billion and we're in debt, you know, trillions. What he was saying is it's systematically in every layer of the government kind of built in how contracts are awarded, in how bidding is done, in what they do. And I'm just think of this guy who worked for the prisons, and he said it's the strangest thing. He had to destroy the cars and the trucks. They would get these new F-150s or Dodge Ram pickups, the very expensive ones, like to haul things around somewhere in the prison systems of New Jersey. And they'd have to basically beat the trucks into a bloody pulp so that they would get new funding for new trucks every year. So they weren't rewarded for having that car last 4 years or 5 years or 8 years. So I'd heard Elon talk somewhere about that whole kind of nature of government waste. And I guess he knows that because of getting government contracts with SpaceX. But so maybe there's a little hope. I got to be a little hopeful.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be encouraging to find those things and to get rid of them, and then people would have some sense that government works better. But if I were to spend my time, I would turn to Social Security and Medicare because it's just where so much money goes. And Social Security, I mean, it's not like a waste of money, but the system, in addition to costing a lot, is at risk of running out. I mean, it's not clear that you and I are going to be getting 100% of what we've been promised. And that's just not that hard of a fix. The retirement age should edge up because we're living longer, although that's kind of plateaued. The way we calculate cost of living probably overstates inflation. That should be tweaked. You probably should take the cap. You pay FICA tax only up to some certain point. That should probably go a little higher. If I had a bunch of students and a six pack of beer, we could probably make Social Security solvent for 50 years. Just with some relatively small changes. But this is kind of where we started. Those are so politically toxic because you could probably get the American public to agree on that if you sold it. But now you've technically raised revenues by raising the cap. Republicans are going to balk at that, including Republicans in a primary, which really goes back to where we started. And Democrats are going to treat even changing the COLA formula, cost of living, as a cut in benefits, although I would say that's not true. It's more of a more accurate calculation of benefits. And now you can't run in either primary, and our reform just died, right? Even though a group of sane people in a room would say, yeah, we ought to do that. Medicare is trickier, but at some point we got to tackle rising healthcare costs.
Yeah, there's a lot of good ways to do that, but nobody's really focusing on that.
Yeah, I mean, basically, it means somebody's got to say no. I mean, we have this horribly macabre example of the United Healthcare CEO getting gunned down as as a terrible, almost like burning someone at the stake for a problem that he did not cause. But the reality is, if you want to spend less, you got to spend smarter, and you do have to say no to some kinds of treatment that are not cost effective, which nobody wants to do. And you got to create healthier people, which is really, really tricky. As a community, we're terribly unhealthy. And these are trickier than just tweaking the formulas on Social Security.
Anything you want to share with our listeners that you haven't been able to share?
Well, I'll elaborate on what I alluded to earlier, which is just the scale of geopolitical risk. You've got Russia and Ukraine. That's like a proxy war. Russia's a nuclear power. You have Syria collapsing in the last couple of weeks. That creates a new vacuum in the Middle East on top of what was already happening with Israel and Gaza. You have not nearly as potentially violent, but you have the United States kind of picking fights with both Canada and Mexico. You have governments falling in both France and Germany. And Germany was always kind of the anchor of Europe. I mean, you have China, kind of because so much else is going on. We're kind of quietly inured to the fact that China is becoming ever more autocratic, kind of gobbled up Hong Kong without much thought. I mean, I'm a product of the 90s when world was getting better. The Berlin Wall came down and it was all unicorns all the time. It's hard to point to any part of the world right now where there isn't a serious risk of some kind of political conflagration that gets bigger in a way that's quite dangerous to us.
And you wrote a book called We Came, We Saw, We Left. And I just wanted to ask you about it.
Yeah, that's the most fun of my books. So, by way of background, so I graduated from Dartmouth in 1988, and I made the decision with my then girlfriend, now wife, that we were going to go around the world. Everybody thought we were crazy. We paid for it ourselves. I went home and caddied for the summer, worked for a law firm, put 50,000 documents in chronological order, and then took off west. And it was 88, 89. So I happened to be traveling. I wasn't still traveling when the Berlin Wall came down, but things were changing in Eastern Europe. I was in China in 1989. I got put under house arrest. So this was a formative life experience, both to see the world. I wrote about it for a local newspaper. It got me into journalism. So in 2016, my wife and I said, let's do it again and let's do it with our kids. And so we came, we saw, we left is the title of the book. The subtitle is 9 months, six continents, three teenagers. And it's our story of 9 months of traveling around the world, again, much more cheaply than you would think. And really, it's a story about parenting teens as you travel through South America and other kinds of places. But it's a very amusing story of our trip around the world while parenting three teens.
And what was your biggest lesson you learned? I'm sure there's a bunch.
The biggest lesson is the world is still really interesting. I'd worry if you'd asked me in 1990, there was all the good news about the Berlin Wall coming down, but there was a little concern that in an era of globalization, the world would just become kind of homogenous. There'd be a Hooters on every corner, and Puerto Vallarta wouldn't look any different than Paris. You'd have kind of the same chains. And that's clearly not true. I mean, even the United States has maintained geographic identities in a good way. South America feels very different. The countries within South America feel very different. So there's still a wonder in traveling and experiencing these places that I will always find very exciting. And there's also a humanity. I mean, we've talked nothing about but troubles and geopolitical conflict, but you know, on the ground in most places in the world, people are fundamentally decent. You can't find an ATM if you turn to a stranger, pretty much anywhere in the world, particularly if you look like me and you're clearly out of place, they will help you, and they will feel pride in where they are. So it was a very optimistic experience for us, and a wonderful reprise of what we'd done in 1988, 89.
And then you're the second person I know who did this and had some type of flesh eating bacteria.
Yeah, yeah, flesh-eating parasite. Wasn't me.
It does
Yeah,
worry me about I did this one time. We went to some Central American country with our kids while they were young. And I felt like I almost died. And
The Amazon is the scariest place I've ever been. I mean, the Amazon, if you read any of those books, like the Percy Fawcett, the explorers of the Amazon, and they always end up like dead and blind and malarial. Like the Amazon just wins. It's bigger, it's snake ridden, it's insect ridden. And that is where my daughter got bit by a sandfly and then contracted leishmaniasis, which is literally is a flesh eating parasite. She was treated in Germany, of all places. But yeah, the Amazon, I think we were deep in the Amazon because we went to this lodge that had been off limits to tourists for a long time. We were kind of guests of somebody who owned it. I think we saw 3 poisonous snakes in the span of like 4 days. And we were so far from anywhere that I just thought, if there's an anti-venom, it doesn't matter because I'm never gonna get there in time. And so, yeah, I mean, there's still parts of the world that are really ferocious, and the Amazon is one of them.
and so she contracted the flesh-eating bacteria in the Amazon.
Yeah, although it wasn't diagnosed for a long time, which is part of the lesson. If we had it was symptomatic only in the sense that she had this small dime-shaped sore on the top of her foot. It looked like a blister that had been popped, but it just didn't get better. Like week after week, it was perfectly symmetrical and it didn't scab over. And at some point, we're like, you got to have a doctor look at it. But by the time you had a doctor look at it, we were no longer in Peru. If we'd been in Peru, because the disease is endemic to Peru, any doctor, particularly in like a poor area, would have said, yeah, it's leishmaniasis because everybody gets it around here. But by then, ironically, we were in New Zealand where nobody ever sees it. So you have like these fancy doctors who are like, well, that must be a staph infection. It's just they've never seen the tropical diseases. So it took several countries. Ultimately, to tie it back to Medicare, the way it got diagnosed is we just kind of went to place after place and they came up with one wrong diagnosis after the next. The sore started getting bigger, and then she got another one on her shin. And my mother, who's like a classic tiger mom, said enough. She wasn't with us, but we were in contact with her. She said, send me a photo of it and I'm going to show it to my doctor. So she's in for some dermatological treatment in Florida. And by some act of divine providence, her dermatologist had done a rotation in tropical diseases, looked at the photo. We were in Cambodia and said, yeah, that's leishmaniasis. And so that with the diagnosis came from Florida. Like, I don't know how you bill Medicare for that. Um, but then we knew where we had to go and what we could do, and we were able to seek
Then
treatment.
you went from Cambodia to Germany for treatment.
Well,
Or
with an intermediate stop in Hanoi.
oh,
So
wow.
we went to what the doctor said is you're going to have to get it confirmed with a biopsy. So we went to Hanoi, not the place that's number one on people's medical tourism list. And we went to a clinic for expats where there was a Singaporean doctor who had done a specialty in tropical diseases. He looked at it, he said, yeah, I think it's leishmaniasis, but you're going to need to go to a hospital to get a biopsy. And then he kind of like looks around and is like, don't do it in this country. It's like, and so we, my daughter had a friend who was half German and kind of as a legacy of World War II, because there's this history of horrible medical experiments in Germany. The Germans, is kind of a mitzvah to the world, created a tropical disease clinic, even though Germany doesn't have many of those diseases. And it just turns out that that's the place where you go, and there's a specialist in leishmaniasis. So yeah, then she flew then we were in Calcutta. She flew from Calcutta to Munich and was treated there. And it's a fairly rigorous treatment. It's a little like chemotherapy. You really got to like shock it.
Wow,
But yeah, she was treated successfully in Munich.
man. So be careful when you travel. That's
Yeah, yeah, but not so careful that you don't do it. I mean, you can always get hit by a car in New York City, so you do kind of have to go out and live.
that's great. Well, thank you so much, Charles Wheelan. And anything you want to plug for our listeners, website, book.
No, I think the naked books are out there. You got Naked Money, Naked Government is coming, Naked Economics, and as we said, if you just want a tour of parenting around the world, then you've got We Came, We Saw, We Left.
Thanks so much, Charles
It
Wheelan.
was a delight.
A lot of fun.